I have to admit that I miss news stories sometimes because it feels like the mainstream media or the US-centric news tries to avoid these stories. So I want to talk about 12 news stories that you might have missed in the past week or two that I think are important to talk about. I tried to find the most recognized news outlet talking about these stories, but some of these sites are a little dodgy because mainstream media is avoiding these stories. But with that said, let's jump right into it with the first story, and I will give my thoughts as we go along. Our first story is about the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and the headline reads, Saudi Arabia enters trade alliance with China, Russia, India, Pakistan, and 4 Central Asian nations to step farther away from reliance on the US dollar. The story goes on to say Saudi Arabia's cabinet approved a decision to join a China-led security bloc, strengthening Riyadh's eastern ties in a farther step away from US interests. A state-owned Saudi press agency said that the Saudi cabinet on Tuesday approved a memorandum awarding Riyadh the status of dialogue partner in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So as we can see, this is something that I've already talked about in previous videos, but Saudi Arabia is slowly or quickly, depending on how you look at it, moving towards China specifically, but also towards Asia. And they're looking to potentially join BRICS, and now they're looking potentially to become possibly a full member of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So let's keep going. That was the first headline, that Saudi Arabia is looking to join the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is obviously a step closer to Asia and a step closer to China. So let's keep going. So next up, I want to share a few stories about the energy markets. And the next headline reads, China and France complete the first LNG gas trade using Chinese yuan, ending reliance on the US dollar for energy trades. So the article goes on to say that the China National Offshore Corporation, the largest offshore oil and gas producer in China, purchased a shipment of LNG from Total Energies through the Shanghai Petroleum and Natural Gas Exchange. The transaction was completed in cross-border yuan settlement, and the transaction volume was about 65,000 tons. So that's the article. This was the first LNG trade in renminbi, and it was sourced through the United Arab Emirates with a French company. So this is kind of where it starts to become a little bit more serious, because Total Energies, which is a oil and gas producer, right? It's one of the larger oil companies, and I think it's actually the largest oil company in France, is willing to accept payment in renminbi. And so in the past videos, we talked about Russia, and we talked about smaller countries like Iran. We talked about smaller countries that might be interested in trading with China. Now we're talking about France. Like, France is supposed to be, the US's ally. Like, that's a very different step in my mind in terms of accepting trade in the renminbi. You would think that the European countries and the United States and like Australia would be like the last countries to accept renminbi, because these countries are, the Western powers. These are the Western countries. So this one is a little bit interesting. This headline is that Total Energies was willing to accept renminbi for their LNG trading, which is, I think, a big step forward. All right, we have a couple more headlines about the oil and gas industry, or the energies markets. So let's keep going. The next headline says Saudi Arabia partners with China to build a Chinese oil refinery for 83.7 billion renminbi, or about 12.2 billion US dollars. So the article says that Saudi Aramco, which is the largest, I'm pretty sure they're the largest oil company still, has agreed to acquire 10% of a Chinese oil refinery for 3.6 billion US dollars. And this is a second deal, because they have already signed a original deal recently that is supposed to strengthen the relationship between Saudi Arabia and its biggest market, which is China now. So this announcement and investment comes the day after Saudi Aramco announced a joint venture with 2 other Chinese companies to build a new 300,000 barrel per day refinery and petrochemical complex in China's northeast. So what we're seeing is this continuation of Saudi Arabia looking at the next 50 to 100 years. The United States over the last 20 years has built out their own oil and gas, and now they are one of the largest oil and gas producers in the world. So the United States is no longer reliant on Saudi oil, and China has become very reliant on Saudi oil. So the Saudi government and the Saudi companies are looking to Asia because they say this is where our largest market is, and this is where it's going to be for the next 50 to 100 years. You know, the United States has had a lot of new energy policies, trying to get electric cars and trying to have renewable energy, and that's pushing Saudi and it's pushing these partnerships away, right? On top of that, the Biden administration has been very opposed to the current king and the crown prince. So there's been a lot of tensions between the two nations. And so they're saying, you know what, we might start trading oil in renminbi. And if we start trading oil in renminbi, we might also start creating these types of projects, start building refineries in China and having a stake in these refineries, because most of our crude is going to go to Asia and it's most likely going to go to China in the future for the next 50 to 100 years. So why don't we start that now? And I feel like that's what the shift is right now. So Saudi Arabia is also looking to trade oil in other currencies, because this next story is from Kenya, and the headline reads, Kenya signs deal with Saudi Arabia and UAE to buy oil with Kenyan shillings instead of the US dollar. The president also, in another story or another piece of news, the president of Kenya tells citizens to get rid of US dollars. That's the headline. And I actually showed the video of him saying that in the last video, and I'll show it again.
For the people who work numbers, I am giving you free advice that those of you who are holding dollars, you surely might go into losses. You better do what you must do, because this market is going to be different in a couple of weeks.
So as we can see from this is just more countries trying to move away from the US dollar. This is Kenya saying that they don't want to use the US dollars, and that if you hold US dollars, you should probably get rid of it because it's going to go into losses, as the president said. So it's interesting to see this happening. Of course, these are headlines that are mostly about the energy markets, because that's kind of the most important market in my mind, because that was what the petrodollar has been built on, right? So if the energy market changes, it means that the US dollar will probably weaken even more, because that's kind of what's backing it. You know, that's part of what's backing it right now. But there's also a few more headlines that I want to share, which are also interesting, that they're a bit more general. So let's keep going. So the next headline reads, China in Brazil to settle trade in their own currencies, ditching the US dollar. And the article goes on to say the Chinese renminbi is speeding up and expanding its global use, a trend that will help build a more resilient international monetary system, one that is less dependent on the US dollar and more conducive to trade growth, experts said on Thursday. So this isn't too surprising. This is a BRICS story, and as the BRICS move forward, more and more nations within the BRICS will start to adopt either a new currency, which is the next story, or adopting the renminbi, or having some kind of exchange platform where they can exchange their own currencies in a way that works. Right now, most countries just use the US dollar in international trade because that is the kind of store of value. You don't have to worry about fluctuation because the US dollar, for the most part, remains at the same value, or at least that's the theory. So it's easy to use it, because if you use one currency worldwide, as long as you have that currency, in this case the US dollar, then you can go to any country and spend that money and people will accept it. But this is obviously falling apart. Many countries are saying, hey, we don't want to use the US dollar anymore for a variety of reasons, which we've talked about in previous videos. So this is just one more step with the BRICS. And I have another story. The next headline is also about BRICS. And this is that basically they are talking about starting their own currency. So the headline reads, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, BRICS, are developing a new currency. And so the story goes on to say the BRICS countries are working on creating a new form of currency and may present ideas on its development at the organization's upcoming summit in South Africa. So as we can see, again, BRICS are talking about trading. We already had Russia and China saying they're going to trade in the renminbi, and now we're saying Brazil is going to trade in their own currencies or possibly in renminbi. And then on top of that, the whole organization is talking about putting forth a plan for a new currency when they meet in the summer. So this is all moving in this direction of de-dollarization, which is again why many of the US-centric news agencies aren't covering it, or if they do cover it, they're not covering it in a very in-depth way, in trying to make it seem like it's somehow related to Russia trying to get around sanctions and that it's not like a real thing. But it's like, no, there's lots of countries that are looking and saying we want off the dollar, from countries in Africa, in South America, to Central America. I mean, even there was an article, I didn't put it into this one, but there was an article saying that Mexico is looking to join BRICS now. So all this is going in a direction that is not looking good for the United States, which is obviously why they're not reporting on it, because they don't want to, I don't know, panic people, or they don't want people to understand how the United States is looking internationally right now. There is an interesting book, and I can't think of the author's name right now, but the book is called The Tipping Point. And it's talking mostly about marketing and trends, but it talks about how many things will happen in the background for many, many, many years. Companies can go on for years before they become popular, or before they hit what he calls the tipping point, to where all of a sudden it becomes mainstream and everybody wants to do it. I saw some YouTubers putting out videos that last summer that the Chinese economy was about to collapse, right? They were saying Chinese economy, banks are failing, everything, 28 days, 23 days. And now, 7-8 months later, they're saying China's won. The US dollar is failing, and China is maybe going to become the new reserve currency. So there's that tipping point, and we might be hitting it now. Of course, a tipping point happens, and then it still takes many years for it to fully develop, which is why I'm saying, in my mind, if this de-dollarization actually goes through, and if this really happens, in the last video I was saying 10 to 15 years. With these new headlines that came out, I'm adjusting it down a little bit more, maybe 10 years. Because, again, you can't just start trading in a new currency, right? They're even talking about this summer they might actually have to develop it. Well, you have to develop it, then you have to stress test it, and then you have to make sure that it's not going to collapse. Because if you put your currency, if it's a new currency, out into the world, you can have all kinds of problems, right? You got to stress test it. You could have it. You don't want it to collapse, and you start trading in this, and then it literally collapses. So these things will take time. But if it's really going in this direction, yeah, it might be, 10 years. I'm not wanting to make predictions. I don't want to be like one of those people in 20 years where I'm like, their de-dollarization's coming, right? Like the people are like, China's going to collapse any day now. But it's just looking at the headlines and seeing how things work and seeing how things go forward. I could say, yeah, maybe 10 years we could see a new currency. Like we might see it in the next 1 or 2 years where it's developed and it's actually starting to be used. But 10 years out, it might be kind of the new reserve currency. Not because these things don't happen overnight. So let's keep moving on. There's a couple more headlines that I have that I think are really interesting. The next one, again, is dealing with the dollar. So the next headline says the Association of Southeast Asian Nations considers dropping the US dollar, the euro, the yen, and the British pound for local currency financial settlements. And so one of the things that they're working on is a digital cross-border payment system. So this could be some kind of digital currency, much like we've seen here with China, where they have their digital yuan. And so this will be maybe a blockchain thing or some kind of digital settlement thing, which they're trying to roll out. So another interesting headline to look at, because these countries, and that's quite a few countries here in Asia, are saying, hey, we want to create a framework or some kind of trading mechanism that allows us to trade in our nations, which obviously is another step away from the US dollar. They're saying we want to trade in our own currencies because we have more control of our own currencies, and we don't want to be dependent or reliant on foreign currencies or major currencies, as the article says. So we have a few more articles saying basically what we've already said, but they're interesting because they're not really getting reported, or at least not getting a lot of traction. So the next one says India to settle trade in Indian rupees with certain countries instead of US dollars. And the article goes on to say India will offer its currency as an alternative for trade to countries that are facing a shortage of dollars in the wake of the sharp tightening of monetary policy by the US Federal Reserve. So this is just another instance of a country saying, hey, we're going to offer trade in our own currency. And the reason we're doing that is because the United States policies are making it more difficult for countries, right? If you jack up the interest rates, that's going to affect the global market, not just the domestic market. So they're saying in order to disaster-proof the currency or the trade, we're willing to offer trade in our own currency. So that's an interesting one because, again, India is part of BRICS. So we can see that these major economies that are part of BRICS are now talking about not using the US dollar. All right, the next article is Chinese yuan surpasses the euro to become Brazil's second largest currency in foreign reserves. Just another interesting story where it shows that Brazil is trying to accumulate renminbi in their reserves so that if they do start trading directly with China in renminbi, they'll have the currency to do it. So it's interesting because all these nations are looking to the future and they're saying, you know, we don't want euros. That's not our future. Our future is China, so we need to get more renminbi into our reserves in order to facilitate trade directly. So, interesting article. Finally, these last two headlines are about issues within the US and European banks, which have been worrying people for the last few months. So this first headline says 5 major banks raided by French authorities in a 100 billion euro fraud investigation. So the article says French authorities raided 5 major banks on March 28th as part of a long-term investigation into alleged money laundering and tax evasion. So again, we saw the Swiss Credit Suisse failed. We saw the banks in the United States fail. And the last story actually says President Biden says the banking crisis is not over yet. So what we're seeing is the European banks are struggling. The US banks are struggling. The rest of the world, Africa, South America, parts of Europe, if you think Russia is part of Europe, Asia, and a lot of countries in Asia are looking to break away from the continuous issues that the banking systems have had in the United States when you have this fractional reserve banking where you don't actually have money, you just kind of magically make more money. And when you don't actually have anything backing your currency, and when you raise your debt ceiling every time you need to raise your debt ceiling, just, we can have more money. When the Fed prints money to rescue businesses that have failed because they had bad business practices, or where you merge smaller banks into bigger banks because the smaller banks would have failed otherwise because, again, bad business practices. This is where a lot of people are starting to say, hey, I don't want to be part of this anymore. And so these were 12 headlines that you might have missed. A couple of them you probably saw, like Biden saying that the banking crisis isn't over yet. But I put that one in there because it's just showing kind of this continuation of why are people talking about de-dollarization? Why are countries trying to break away, and kind of what's the next step? And honestly, if there's a meeting for the BRICS in the summer, like I was saying, in the one article, and they're talking about possibly putting forth an idea of a new currency, conversations will happen. Conversations with my cat will happen. Conversations will happen, and countries will decide, is this the best way to move forward? And then if they decide that's the best way to move forward, then it'll take time to actually implement it. And then once it's implemented, it'll take time to actually become the trading kind of norm. Because, again, people will hedge their bets until they don't. Which means you could have 5 to 6 years of people slowly starting to adopt the new currency because they're hedging their bets. Is it going to work? Is it going to fail? Is the United States going to counter it? What's going to be done? Is it going to be accepted by all nations? Is it only going to be accepted by the BRICS? Who's going to really trade on this new currency? So you see people hedging their bet where they start to accumulate this new currency over a few years. And then if they say, yeah, this is the future, then they'll dump the dollars. We already seen some countries dumping dollars for, I don't know, gold and other things. But I think that's why I'm kind of like at a 10-year mark in my mind, because it will take 2 to 3 years just to get it set up. And then at first, they won't just release it to the whole world and say, hey, everybody come use this new currency. And even if they do release it to the whole world and say, hey, everybody come use this new currency and trade on this currency, most financial institutions and most companies will slowly adopt it because they will be hesitant, right? They'll hedge their bets. You don't want to put all your eggs in one basket, as we say. And so nobody's going to dump all their dollars for the new currency and then possibly the new currency fails. So they'll, start at 10%, 20%, 30%, 50%, and then 100%. And that takes, that's laid out over a couple of years. So that's why I think, anybody who's saying the dollar is going to be replaced tomorrow, they're lying to you. But at the same time, anybody who says it's never going to be replaced is also lying to you, because history has proven that every currency ends up being replaced. There has not been a fiat currency that has remained dominant forever. And it usually is a cycle of about 100 years. And the US dollar is hitting that kind of 100-year cycle. What are your thoughts of these 12 headlines? If you're still here, leave a comment below. Had you seen all of them? Are they interesting? Are you tired of me talking about de-dollarization and you want me just to get back to China stuff? Leave a comment below. I do read most of them. I read all of them. I reply to some of them, depending on if you're calling me something crazy or not. But yeah, leave a comment below and I will see you in the next video. If you want to see the last video where I went out and walked around, you can click here, where I also talked a little bit about this de-dollarization issue or opportunity, depending on how you look at it. And I will see you over there.